9:17 a.m. over the Pacific. American bombers open their bay doors at 20,000 feet. 40 seconds later, nothing. Japanese destroyers simply turn and sail on. Precision bombing has failed. So one general asks a forbidden question: what if we put a tank cannon on an airplane? At 9:17 a.m., the bomb bay doors closed and the American crews leaned forward in their seats, counting the seconds. 40 of them. That's how long a bomb takes to fall from 20,000 feet. 40 seconds of hope. 40 seconds of belief in math manuals, in the promise of modern air power. Below them, Japanese destroyers cut through the Solomon Sea in perfect formation, gray steel, slicing blue water. The Norden bomb sites said, "This should work." The calculations were flawless. Wind drift corrected. Release levers pulled. Then the ocean erupted not in fire, but in harmless white plumes. Every bomb missed, not by inches, but by hundreds of yards. The destroyers didn't scatter. They didn't panic. Their captains simply watched, ordered a calm turn, and sailed on untouched. It happened again and again, day after day. Millions of dollars in bombs, fuel, and aircraft splashed uselessly into the Pacific, while the Tokyo Express ran supplies straight to the front lines. The future of warfare the Army had promised was precision bombing. Out here, that future was a lie. The truth was brutal, and it had nothing to do with courage or skill. It was physics. A bomb dropped from high altitude takes nearly a full minute to reach the sea. In that minute, a destroyer moving at 30 knots can change its position by half a mile. Japanese captains knew this. They watched the American bombers climb, saw the bay doors open, and simply waited. When the bombs fell, they turned, clean, effortless, almost bored. What was supposed to be impossible was happening every day. The U.S. Army Air Forces had built an entire doctrine on the idea that altitude meant safety and accuracy. But over the Southwest Pacific, that doctrine was bleeding out. Crews flew home exhausted and empty-handed. Maintenance teams scavenged wrecks for spare parts. Morale sank with every missed attack. Meanwhile, Japanese destroyers ran the slot like it belonged to them, unloading men guns and ammunition without a scratch on their hulls. This was the nightmare waiting on the desk of a new commander when he arrived in theater. Major General George Kenney didn't look like a man who worshipped manuals. He was short, blunt, and aggressive, more shop foreman than polished general. When he read the reports of high-altitude raids, he didn't debate them. He threw them away. Kenney understood the problem instantly. Trying to hit a warship from 20,000 feet was like dropping a marble from a skyscraper into a coffee cup being dragged by a sprinting cat. The enemy wasn't brave. They were just faster than gravity. If air power was going to matter in this war, it couldn't stay in the clouds. It had to go down into the spray, into the flak, right in front of the guns. And once Kenney reached that conclusion, the war in the Pacific was about to take a very dangerous turn. Getting lower was easy to say. Surviving it was another matter. At mast height, machine guns were useless. Rifle caliber rounds skipped off destroyer hulls like gravel off armor. Kenney didn't need noise, he needed shock. He needed something that could tear into a boiler room, smash a bridge, and stop a ship now. That's when his eyes landed on the impossible. Sitting on airfield hardstands and in dusty depots was the Army's 75mm field gun, a brute born in World War I designed to crack bunkers and punch through tanks. It fired a 15-pound shell with enough force to wreck concrete and steel. On land, it was bolted to the earth. In tanks, 30 tons of armor absorbed its kick. In an airplane, it had no business being there. Kenny didn't care. He looked at the B-25 Mitchell, a tough, overbuilt medium bomber, and saw not a bomber, but a delivery system. The idea was pure madness: rip off the glass nose, shove a tank cannon into the front of a twin-engine aircraft, and fly it straight at a warship. The weight alone was a nightmare. The recoil was worse. When engineers ran the numbers, the results screamed red. They warned the blast would shear rivets, shatter cockpit glass, stall, the aircraft maybe tear the nose clean off. They called it a flying coffin. Kenny called it necessary. While engineers talked stress limits, Japanese destroyers were unloading troops. While slide rules argued physics, men were dying in the jungle. Kenny wasn't asking permission, he was issuing a verdict. The manuals went into the trash. He ordered the nose rebuilt in steel, the cockpit rearranged, and a man added whose sole job was to hand-load artillery shells in midair. It was a bet against physics, against doctrine, against common sense. And everyone involved knew that when the trigger was finally pulled, the airplane or the war was going to break first. The engineers didn't argue anymore. They warned, they documented, they predicted disaster in clean-typed pages filled with words like catastrophic failure and structural collapse. Then they were overruled. Orders came down, and the impossible became mandatory. A prototype would be built, not because anyone believed in it, but because the war demanded it. On factory floors and in sweltering Pacific hangars, the B-25 was mutilated. The elegant glass nose, once home to the bombardier, and his precision optics, was sawed off like a limb. In its place went blunt steel, bolted and welded with brute force. Inside that steel snout, crews cradled the massive 75mm cannon. It was so large the pilot could almost touch the breech from his seat. There was no automation, no elegance, just metal hydraulics and violence waiting to be unleashed. The aircraft's balance was ruined instantly. The nose sagged toward the ground like a wounded animal. To fix it, mechanics didn't consult aerodynamic charts. They bolted raw lead into the tail until the plane sat level again. It was ugly, heavy, wrong by every rule of flight. Test pilots reported it handled like a dump truck with wings. The sleek bomber was gone. What remained was something else entirely, a flying battering ram. Inside the cockpit, the changes were just as severe. The navigator station was ripped out. The bombardier was gone. In their place stood a new crewman with the most terrifying job in the Air Forces, the cannon loader. He would stand inches from the gun wrestle, 15-pound shells in turbulence, slam them home by hand, and brace for recoil that felt like a car crash. One mistake meant death. Rumors spread fast. Pilots joked the plane would fly backward when it fired. They called it the flying artillery. Beneath the laughter was fear. No one knew what would happen when that trigger was pulled for the first time. Would the wing stay on? Would the engine stall? Or would the aircraft simply disintegrate? In midair, there was no more room for theory. The next step wasn't a meeting, it was a takeoff. And once that cannon fired, there would be no walking the idea back. The test flight was a confession booth for everyone involved. There would be no excuses once the wheels left the runway. The modified B-25 lumbered forward engines, straining using nearly every foot of asphalt before clawing its way into the humid air. It climbed slowly, painfully, like it didn't want to fly at all. Every vibration felt wrong. Every groan of metal sounded like a warning. The target was a lonely coral reef off the coast, chosen because no one would die if the airplane tore itself apart. Inside the cockpit, the tension was suffocating. Sweat ran down backs despite the slipstream. The new crewman in the nose. The cannon loader gripped a 15-pound shell like a weightlifter before a deadlift. No powered rammer, no safety net, just muscle and timing. He shoved the round into the breech, slammed it shut, and shouted over the engines, "Gun ready." The pilot lined up the nose using a crude iron sight bolted to the dashboard. No bomb sight, no computer, just instinct. He steadied his hands and squeezed the trigger. The airplane didn't just fire, it stopped. For a split second, forward motion felt arrested, as if the B-25 had slammed into an invisible wall. The recoil hammered through the airframe with the violence of a collision. Rivets screamed. The cockpit filled with choking white smoke and the sharp bite of burned propellant. Teeth rattled. Vision vanished. Then the smoke cleared. The wings were still there. The engines were still turning. The control column still answered. And below them, the reef exploded water and pulverized coral, erupting exactly where the nose had been pointed. Physics hadn't won. Fear hadn't won. The airplane had survived. On the ground, mechanics and engineers stared in stunned silence. The math had said this couldn't work. The reports had promised disaster. But the evidence was hanging in the air, still flying. The impossible had just become real. That single shot changed everything. It proved that a bomber could carry artillery, that recoil could be tamed, that doctrine could be broken. The question was no longer, can it fire? Now there was a far more dangerous one waiting to be answered. What happens when that cannon is aimed at a living firing warship that intends to kill you first? Proving it could fire was the easy part. Learning how to fight with it was something else entirely. Overnight, the rules of bombing were thrown out. A bomber was meant to be steady, predictable, a flying platform for falling explosives. This machine demanded the opposite. The cannon was fixed forward. It didn't swivel. It didn't forgive. To aim it, the pilot had to aim the entire airplane. That meant diving straight at the target. No weaving, no last-second jink, just a long, terrifying approach run directly into enemy guns. The pilots called it bore sighting, but it felt more like a game of chicken played at 200 miles an hour. On paper, the 75mm could reach out thousands of yards. In reality, no one trusted it beyond 1,000. To guarantee a hit, they had to get close enough to see details, railings, gun shields, faces. Training was relentless. Crews attacked old wrecks and abandoned hulks, learning the brutal rhythm of the run. Dive, steady, fire. Absorb the recoil. Recover, reload, fire again. If the loader was fast and didn't black out from G-forces, maybe 3 rounds per pass. This wasn't a machine gun. It was a sniper rifle with wings. Miss, and you had to circle back, exposing your belly to every gun on the ship. Inside the cockpit, teamwork became survival. The pilot flew and aimed. The co-pilot managed engines and called range. The loader worked like a piston shell. Up, breech, open, slam, lock, brace, load, fire, load, fire. Brass casings piled up on the floor, rolling underfoot with every maneuver. Hands blistered, muscles screamed. Fear was constant. The first real targets weren't destroyers. They were barges, small supply boats creeping along coastlines at dawn. and the results were immediate and shocking. Bombs often punched clean holes straight through wood without detonating. The 75mm didn't punch holes. It erased ships. One hit turned a barge into splinters, fuel, and fire. Crews came home wide-eyed, silent, realizing what they'd just unleashed. The joke stopped. The skepticism vanished. The so-called suicide box had teeth. And as names were painted on steel noses and more guns were bolted into place, everyone understood the truth. This weapon wasn't a gimmick, it was a hunter, and soon it would be pointed at something that could shoot back. The real test arrived with the Tokyo Express. Japanese destroyers, fast, disciplined, and arrogant, were still running troops and supplies down the slot, like nothing could touch them. These were not barges. A destroyer was 300 feet of hardened steel wrapped in flak guns and crewed by men who had spent months shooting airplanes out of the sky. To them, a medium bomber at low altitude was a gift. Big, slow, dead. Late in 1942, Japanese command assembled a major convoy to reinforce New Guinea. Fast transports, veteran escorts, confidence bordering on contempt. They believed speed would save them and altitude would protect them. They didn't know the rules had changed. At dawn, under low clouds hugging the water, the modified B-25s rolled down the runway heavy with fuel and artillery shells. Radios were quiet. Jokes were gone. Every crew knew what waited ahead. If the engineers had been right, one solid hit from a destroyer's main gun would turn their airplane into confetti. If Kenny had been right, they were about to hunt warships. When the clouds broke, the convoy appeared gray hulls cutting white wakes through dark water. The Japanese spotted them immediately. Black flak burst in the sky. Standard procedure followed: turn broadside, bring every gun to bear. But the bombers didn't climb. They didn't open bomb bays. They shoved the yokes forward and dropped down to 50 feet above the waves, props kicking up, spray engines screaming. From the bridge of the lead destroyer, the approach looked familiar. Low aircraft meant torpedoes. The captain ordered the ship to turn into the attack, narrowing the target. It was textbook defense. Then confusion set in. The American plane didn't release anything. It didn't pull up. It didn't dodge. It came straight on, nose down, charging head-on like it wanted to collide. Tracers reached out, cracking past the cockpit. The air filled with smoke and steel. Inside the B-25, the world collapsed to a ring sight and white knuckles on the controls. The pilot couldn't flinch. To aim the cannon, he had to hold steady. He was the guidance system. Machine guns opened first, a brutal curtain of fire that swept the bow and bridge, smashing glass and forcing gunners down. The flak faltered. That was the opening. At close range, dangerously close, the loader tapped the pilot's shoulder. The shell was live. The pilot made a final micro-adjustment and squeezed the trigger. The airplane slammed back against its own momentum. Smoke filled the cockpit. And then the shell hit, punching through steel, detonating deep inside the ship. The destroyer lurched, wounded and burning. For the first time in the Pacific, a warship had been cracked open by an airplane firing artillery. And everyone in the sky knew there was no going back now. The first hit didn't kill the destroyer, but it broke the spell. Smoke poured from the bow, black and angry, and the ship's perfect white wake faltered. Whatever the shell had found inside boiler steam line, electrical trunk, it had bitten deep. The predator was bleeding. And in war, that's all it takes. The B-25 screamed overhead so low, the rear gunner could see sailors scattering on the deck below. As the pilot hauled the aircraft into a hard turn, gravity doubled inside the fuselage. This was the most dangerous moment. The cannon loader fought the G-force's boots slipping on the vibrating metal floor as he dragged another 15-pound shell from the rack. Muscles burned. Vision narrowed. He slammed the round into the breech, locked it, and screamed into the intercom. The gun was ready again. The pilot rolled back toward the target. The destroyer wasn't maneuvering anymore. It was limping, listing slightly fire-licking from twisted steel. Anti-aircraft fire resumed, but it was wild now. Fear had replaced discipline. The hunters had become something else in the sailors' minds. This wasn't an airplane anymore. It was a charging animal. The second run was deliberate. The pilot aimed for the stern where speed lived. Once again, machine guns raked the deck, pinning crews behind shields. Once again, the cannon fired. The recoil shook the airframe like a fist. The shell struck near the depth charge racks, and the world detonated. A secondary explosion tore the aft section open in a rolling fireball. Debris arced into the air. The water itself rippled outward in a dark, expanding ring. When the smoke cleared, the destroyer's wake was gone. The screws had stopped. The ship lay crippled, dead in the water. That was the signal. The rest of the squadron dropped in, switching weapons. Bombs skipped across the sea like flat stones, slamming into the hull and detonating against steel. The destroyer groaned as plates buckled and water rushed in. A warship that had ruled these waters for a year was beaten to death in minutes, not by a battleship, not by a submarine, but by modified bombers flying at wave-top height. As the B-25s pulled away, radio. Chatter erupted, shouts, laughter, disbelief. Adrenaline spilled out with the words. But beneath it was something heavier, a realization settling in. The equation of naval warfare had just been shattered. Speed was no longer enough. Flak was no longer a shield. If an airplane could carry a tank gun and survive long enough to use it, then the ocean had become a killing ground. And the Japanese Navy had just learned that lesson the hard way. When the B-25s turned for home, they didn't look like victors. They looked battered, scorched, barely held together. Soot streaked the steel noses. Paint blistered from muzzle blasts. Inside the cockpits, hot brass casings rolled across the floor, with every bank chiming like broken glass. Hands shook. Ears rang. Flight suits were soaked through with sweat. These weren't men celebrating a clean win. They were men coming down from a near-death collision with reality. But the truth waited on the runway. As the wheels slammed onto the strip at Port Moresby and the engines wound down, something spread through the crews faster than any order, disbelief turning into certainty. They hadn't just survived. They had changed the rules. In the debriefing room, the proof flickered to life. Grainy gun camera footage showed the impossible, an airplane firing artillery shells, striking steel explosions blooming from inside a destroyer's hull. There was no arguing with it, no theory left to debate. The ship hadn't been damaged, it had been killed. General Kenny watched in silence. Then he smiled, the tight, satisfied smile of a man who had gambled his career, his pilots and the war itself, on an idea everyone else had called insane. He ordered the photos rushed stateside. He wanted every engineer who had warned him about torn wings and stalled engines to see the truth burned into film. The airplane had held. The physics had bent. And the Japanese Navy had paid the price. What followed was immediate and irreversible. Factories stopped hesitating and started building. The B-25G went into production followed by even heavier armed versions. Armor was added, guns multiplied. The Mitchell stopped pretending to be aerodynamic and embraced what it had become, a street fighter of the sky. Out on the water, the effect was just as dramatic. Japanese captains no longer steamed confidently in daylight. Convoys hugged coastlines, hid in weather, ran at night. The Tokyo Express, the symbol of untouchable speed, had lost its nerve. The hunters were being hunted now. The age of the invincible surface ship was cracking. And it wasn't cracking under elegant theory or perfect math. It was breaking under brute force, low altitude, and the sound of a cannon firing from an airplane that was never supposed to exist. The cannon's reign was violent and brief. As 1943 bled into 1944, the war accelerated and technology began to catch up with desperation. The 75mm gun had saved the campaign when nothing else worked, but it demanded perfection. Pilots needed nerves of steel. Loaders needed brute strength. One missed run meant circling back through flak. It was raw human unforgiving. Then came the rockets. High-velocity aircraft rockets, lighter, cleaner, easier. A pilot could loose a full salvo with a single squeeze, no recoil hammering the airframe. No man wrestling shells inches from an explosion. Firepower multiplied, risk dropped. The brutal elegance of the cannon gave way to efficiency. Later B-25s lost the big gun, replacing it with solid noses packed with machine guns, flying buzzsaws that shredded targets by volume instead of a single killing blow. The crews missed the monster. They missed the moment when the plane seemed to stop in midair, when you felt the shot in your bones. But wars don't reward nostalgia. They reward what works. The cannon had done its job. It bridged a gap between failure and dominance long enough for the next generation of weapons to arrive. When the war ended, the gunships faded quietly. Cannons were unbolted. Airframes scrapped or sold. Pilots went home and folded those days into silence. The story shrank into a footnote, an insane improvisation from a desperate time. But ideas don't die that easily. They wait. 20 years later, in another jungle war, the concept returned. Old transport planes circled targets, pouring fire from the sky. Then came the ultimate descendant, a massive gunship carrying cannons and howitzers, orbiting like a predator, raining precision destruction below. Every shot echoed the same defiance of physics, first proven over the Pacific. The engineers had said it couldn't be done. The manuals had called it suicide. But history isn't written by caution. It's written by people who look at impossible problems and choose violence, ingenuity, and nerve. Once a general threw a rule book away. Once a pilot aimed an airplane like a rifle. And once a bomber became a battleship long enough to change a war. The story should have ended there, with scrap metal surplus guns and forgotten airframes. Most people assume that's how war innovations die. Used once, filed away, replaced by something cleaner, smarter, more modern. But this idea refused to stay buried, because what the B-25 gunships proved wasn't just that a cannon could fly. They proved something far more dangerous, that air power didn't need elegance to dominate. It needed persistence. The bomber with a tank gun had shattered a rule everyone thought was permanent. And once a rule is broken, it never truly comes back. Years later, new wars dragged old lessons out of dusty archives. In Southeast Asia, American forces faced a familiar problem. Enemies hidden in jungle moving at night, immune to fast jets screaming overhead. Precision alone wasn't enough. Speed wasn't enough. What was needed was presence, pressure, a weapon that could stay and keep firing. So the idea returned older, heavier, meaner. Transport planes were turned into orbiting killers. Guns mounted sideways. Crews circling targets for hours, pouring controlled destruction into the dark. The concept had matured, but its soul was unchanged. The lineage was unmistakable. Every shell fired was an echo of that first insane shot from a B-25 nose over the Pacific. Today's gunships carry weapons. General Kenny could only dream of cannons larger than his field gun, guided munitions sensors that see through night and weather. But strip away the technology and the philosophy remains brutally simple. Get close, hit hard, don't let go. The engineers once said the recoil would tear the wings off. They were wrong. The wings held. What broke instead was certainty, the belief that war must follow neat equations and perfect designs. The men who flew those early gunships proved that innovation doesn't come from comfort. It comes from corners, from desperation, from people willing to fly something that shouldn't exist because the alternative is losing. We tell this story because it almost vanished. Because the Green Dragons, the loaders choking on cordite, the pilots charging steel ships head-on, none of it fits the clean myth of technological progress. It was messy, dangerous, human. And because sometimes history isn't changed by the smartest solution on paper. Sometimes it's changed by the one bold enough to pull the trigger anyway. History likes clean lines, timelines, bullet points. But real change is loud, improvised, and usually smells like smoke. The flying artillery never fit neatly into doctrine, and that's exactly why it mattered. For a brief, violent moment, it solved a problem no one else could. It didn't win the war by itself, but it kept the war from being lost when the math said defeat was inevitable. The men who flew those missions didn't think of themselves as pioneers. They were just trying to survive the next run. Years later, many of them struggled to explain what it felt like to aim an entire airplane, like a rifle, to charge a steel warship head-on, knowing one lucky hit could erase them from the sky. There were no medals for inventing a new way to kill ships, just quiet memories locked away. As the decades passed, the story faded. Textbooks talked about carriers, submarines, rockets. The B-25 gunships became a footnote, an odd experiment from a desperate phase of the war. But footnotes matter. They're where the rules get broken. They're where future wars steal their best ideas. Every modern gunship owes a debt to that moment when someone ignored the manual and trusted nerve over numbers. When engineers said no and pilots said, "Watch me." When a bomber stopped being a delivery system and became a weapon in its own right. We tell this story because it reminds us that innovation isn't always clean. It doesn't always arrive with approval stamps and perfect equations. Sometimes it shows up welded together in a hot hangar, balanced with lead bars and flown by men who know it might kill them. The B-25 with a cannon wasn't elegant, it wasn't efficient, but it was honest. It met the enemy where they were and hit them with everything it had. And for a crucial stretch of the Pacific War, That was enough. If this story hit you, don't let it disappear again. Like the video, stay subscribed, and leave a comment, because history only survives if someone is still willing to tell it. And that's the part most people miss. This wasn't a story about a gun or even about an airplane. It was a story about a moment when the war demanded an answer, now not after another study, not after another revision. A moment when failure was bleeding men out of the jungle, and waiting was more dangerous than being wrong. The B-25 gunship existed in that narrow space between desperation and invention. It wasn't born from perfect theory. It was born from refusal, the refusal to accept that nothing could be done. The refusal to let equations decide the outcome while ships sailed freely and men died ashore. General Kenny didn't win because he was smarter than the engineers. He won because he was willing to be blamed, willing to risk ridicule, careers, and lives on an idea that looked insane on paper but made brutal sense in combat. And the crews who flew those planes weren't heroes because they were fearless. They were heroes because they climbed into cockpits knowing the plane might not forgive a single mistake and flew anyway. That mindset echoes far beyond World War II. Every time a rule is broken in warfare, every time doctrine lags behind reality, this story repeats itself in different shapes and different skies. Innovation doesn't come from comfort. It comes from corners, when the enemy has momentum, when options are gone, when someone decides that the old answers are no longer acceptable. The flying artillery didn't last forever. It didn't need to. Its job was to bridge a gap, to buy time to smash a door open so the next generation of weapons could walk through. And it did that job perfectly. So when we talk about World War II machines, we shouldn't just ask what they were designed to do. We should ask why they were pushed beyond their limits and who had the nerve to push them. Because history isn't shaped by flawless machines, it's shaped by flawed ones, flown by stubborn people in moments when failure is no longer an option. And if there's one final truth this story leaves behind, it's this: wars don't turn on genius alone. They turn on nerve, on people willing to look at a machine, a rule book, a neat line of math, and decide none of it matters as much as stopping the enemy right now. The B-25 with a cannon wasn't elegant history. It was loud, violent, and temporary. It existed only because the moment demanded something reckless enough to work. And once that moment passed, it faded, just like so many tools forged in crisis. But fading doesn't mean failing. Some ideas aren't meant to last forever. They're meant to hit once hard enough to change the direction of the fight. For a brief window in the Pacific surface, ships stopped being untouchable. Speed stopped being safety. Flak stopped being confidence. Somewhere between the spray of the waves and the blast of a 75mm shell, the balance shifted. The ocean got smaller, deadlier, honest. The men who made that happen didn't think in terms of legacy. They were thinking about the next approach, the next reload, the next burst of tracer fire ripping past the cockpit glass. They were thinking about getting home. History came later, written quietly long after the cordite smell had faded from their clothes. That's why stories like this matter. Not because they celebrate destruction, but because they expose how fragile certainty really is. How often impossible is just another word for untested. How progress sometimes comes not from refinement, but from collision between desperation and imagination. The flying artillery was never meant to be comfortable. It was meant to end an argument, and it did. It told the world that air power wasn't finished. Evolving, that dominance belonged not to the side with the cleanest theories, but to the one willing to adapt faster than fear. And once that lesson was learned, it didn't disappear. It sank deep into doctrine, into memory, into the next war waiting over the horizon.
March 3, 1943. The Bismarck Sea is calm at dawn. Admiral Kimura believes his convoy is untouchable. Then shapes skim the waves. American B-25s. Guns roar. Steel burns. In just 15 minutes, an entire division vanishes. The sun was just climbing over the horizon when the Bismarck Sea revealed itself wide, calm, almost gentle. Thin clouds drifted across a pale sky, and the water reflected gold and blue like a mirror untouched by war. On the bridge of the destroyer, Shirayuki Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura stood with his hands clasped behind his back, watching his convoy cut clean white wakes through the sea. 8 destroyers, 8 transport ships, nearly 7,000 soldiers packed below deck. Everything was in perfect order. For more than a year, these waters had belonged to Japan. Convoys sailed under a shield of disciplined steel and experience. American bombers had come before high-flying B-17s that missed slow torpedo planes that died in fire. Nothing had ever broken the pattern. Doctrine worked. Training worked. Confidence followed. Below the decks, young soldiers from Osaka, Kyoto, Sapporo laughed softly, wrote letters home, and sipped tea as the ships rolled gently beneath them. This was just a crossing. The real fight waited on land. No alarms sounded. No sirens screamed. The sea felt safe. At 600 hours, Kimura raised his binoculars and studied the horizon. No enemy contacts. Good visibility. On schedule. What he could not see was that history was already moving toward him, low, fast, and deadly, about to tear apart everything he believed the sea would allow. Far to the south, while Kimura's convoy cut its steady path through the Bismarck Sea, the rules of naval warfare were already dying. In the choking heat of an Australian airfield beneath rattling tin roofs and clouds of red dust, American crews worked in silence. This wasn't a factory. It was a place where desperation replaced permission and where failure meant more men dying on distant beaches. At the center of it all stood Major Paul "Pappy" Gunn. He was not a polished strategist or a desk-bound planner. He was a mechanic who flew a pilot who fixed his own machines, and a man who had seen too many bombers return empty while convoys sailed on untouched. High-altitude bombing didn't work. Torpedoes failed. And every missed ship meant another American grave in New Guinea. Gunn refused to accept that. So he broke the bomber. He rolled a B-25 Mitchell into a hangar and began tearing it apart by hand. The glass nose came off. The Norden bomb site, once sacred, was ripped out and tossed aside. Anything that didn't make the airplane deadlier was stripped away. Steel plates were welded into the nose. Then came the guns. 2.50 caliber, then 4, then 6. Finally, 8 long barrels jutted forward like the fangs of a machine built to kill at close range. The mechanics hesitated. There were no manuals, no orders, only Gunn's certainty. He recalculated the balance himself, shifted fuel, added counterweights. When the modified B-25 lifted off for its first test, the airframe trembled under the weight of steel and ammunition. At low altitude, Gunn squeezed the trigger. The sky didn't crack. It screamed. Shell casings poured from the fuselage like rain. The recoil hammered through the aircraft as if it were alive. When Gunn landed, he was smiling. "She doesn't bomb anymore," he said quietly. "She eats ships." Word spread fast. What had begun as a gamble in a dusty hangar was about to meet its first real targets. And far to the north, Admiral Kimura had no idea that the sea he trusted was about to rise up and betray him. What Gunn had created was only half the weapon. Guns could shred steel, but ships were still hard to kill. To finish them, the Americans needed a way to put bombs inside a moving hull. That answer came from another quiet officer who was tired of watching failure from 10,000 feet. Major William Benn of the 43rd Bombardment Group had seen enough missed runs to know the truth. The Pacific was too wide, the weather too violent, Japanese captains too skilled. High-altitude bombing against ships wasn't courage, it was futility. So Ben looked down, not up. He watched waves break against reefs. He watched children skip stones across water. And one thought refused to let go. What if the bomb didn't fall? What if it skipped? At Port Moresby, he gathered his crews and explained the idea. Fly straight, fly level, fly so low the sea fills the windshield. Release the bomb at the last second and let it bounce across the surface once, maybe twice, then smash into the ship at the waterline. The room went silent. Everyone understood the risk. One burst of anti-aircraft fire at that height could tear a bomber apart. Release too early and the bomb skips away. Too late, and it ricochets back into the aircraft. They tested it anyway. Day after day, B-25s roared in over a wrecked cargo ship trapped on a reef. Propellers threw spray into the air. Bombs skipped wild, exploded short, or missed entirely. Aircraft were lost. Crews were shaken. But slowly, something clicked. Pilots learned the rhythm, the speed, the moment when sea and machine aligned. At the right height, the right angle, the bomb behaved like it wanted to kill ships. When one finally struck true, skipping once before slamming into the rusted hull and detonating inside the explosion, lifted the wreck out of the water. Watching from shore, commanders understood immediately. Gunn's strafers would silence the guns. Ben's bombs would finish the job. Two reckless ideas had just fused into a single deadly doctrine. And somewhere beyond the horizon, a Japanese convoy sailed on unaware that the ocean itself had been turned into a weapon. By late February 1943, the pieces were finally in place. Gunn's strafers and Ben's skip bombers were no longer experiments. They were weapons. At airstrips carved from jungle and mud, crews trained until exhaustion blurred the horizon. They flew at mast height, 50 feet above the sea, so low their reflections raced beneath the fuselage. One mistake meant death. Precision was the only protection they had. The plan was brutally simple. The strafers would go in first, fast, low, and screaming, unleashing 8.50 caliber guns to rip open bridges, shred anti-aircraft crews, and blind captains at the helm. Seconds later, the bombers would follow, releasing their bombs so close the ships would have no time to react. The entire attack would be over in less than a minute. No warning, no recovery. Pilots practiced attacking from the sun, from the wind, from angles that radar couldn't see and gunners couldn't track. Mechanics painted shark mouths and names on aluminum noses, ruthless, dirty Dora Hell's Angel, not for bravado but to remind themselves these machines were hunters now. At night, men slept beside their aircraft, afraid to miss the call. Then the call came. Intelligence confirmed a Japanese convoy was moving toward Leh. 8 transports, 8 destroyers, thousands of troops. To Tokyo, it was routine. To the men at Port Moresby and Eagle Farm, it was the moment everything had been built for. Maps were spread across briefing tables. Grease pencils traced approach routes over the Bismarck Sea. Armorers loaded belts of ammunition and set delay fuses by hand. In the early hours of March 3rd, engines coughed to life in the darkness. Rain misted the runway. Harnesses were tightened. Someone whispered a prayer. One by one, the B-25s lifted into the night navigation lights, blinking as they disappeared over the jungle. Far to the north, Admiral Kimura's convoy sailed on beneath a rising sun, unaware that the aircraft hunting them were no longer bombers at all, but something new, fast and unforgiving, already racing low across the sea. At 10 a.m., the first warning came exactly as Admiral Kimura expected. Lookouts spotted silver flashes high above the horizon, American B-17Ss glinting in the sun. Kimura lowered his binoculars, calm, almost relieved. This was familiar. High-altitude bombers. Predictable. Harmless. He ordered the convoy to maintain course. Anti-aircraft crews swung their guns skyward, loaders feeding belts as black bursts of flak bloomed above the ships. The sea thundered with disciplined fire. Every eye looked up. No one looked down. 15 miles away, skimming the waves at nearly 300 miles an hour, a different kind of aircraft was coming in. 12 B-25's noses packed with guns' propellers whipping mist off the surface. They flew so low, their shadows raced across the water. Sunlight flashed on aluminum fuselages as they rose just enough to clear the swells, then dropped again, invisible to radar, unstoppable to human reflex. Major Ed Larner led the charge. Through his windshield, he could already see the Japanese convoy, perfect formation, white wakes slicing the sea. He watched the flak burst uselessly far above and smiled grimly. The trap had worked. A shout went up on the destroyer Shirayuki. Aircraft low guns tried to swing down crews, scrambling in panic. Too late. Larner pressed the trigger. The nose of his B-25 exploded in flame. 8.50 caliber machine guns roared as one, a solid wall of fire tearing forward at nearly 3,000 feet per second. Bridges shattered. Steel buckled. Men vanished in sparks and smoke. Anti-aircraft crews died before they could fire a single round. The sound wasn't gunfire anymore. It was a mechanical scream, a force of nature ripping across the deck. Bombs followed, skipping across the sea like stones slamming into hulls below the waterline before detonating deep inside. Ships lurched. Fire erupted. Smoke clawed into the sky. Behind Larner, more B-25s surged, in each picking a target, each delivering the same brutal lesson. In seconds, the convoy's perfect order collapsed into chaos. And Admiral Kimura, standing on a deck suddenly alive with fire, realized the truth too late. The sea he trusted had just turned against him. The attack did not slow. It multiplied. As Larner's B-25 clawed past, the burning Shirayuki, 11 more strafers poured in behind him, each one diving into the smoke and fire like a predator picking its kill. The convoy dissolved in seconds. Destroyers swerved violently, throwing up white walls of water as captains tried desperately to shield the transports. It only made them easier to hit. One after another, the B-25s came in low and fast. Guns walked lines of fire from bow to stern, cutting bridges apart, shredding rangefinders, ripping gunners from their mounts before they could even turn their weapons. Men ran. Men burned. Commands were never shouted. There was no one left alive to give them. Then the skip bombers followed. Bombs slapped the surface of the sea, bounced once, twice, and smashed into steel hulls at the waterline. The explosions came from inside the ships. Transports split open like torn cans. Engine rooms vanished in fire. Ammunition cooked off in violent bursts that lifted entire decks into the air. The destroyer Horatio tried to interpose itself between the attackers and the transports turning bravely into the storm. 3 strafers hit it at once. 24 machine guns raked the bridge in a single converging stream. When the smoke cleared, the bridge was gone. Seconds later, the crippled ship slammed into a transport beside it, both vessels locking together in flames. The air above the convoy became a furnace. Tracer fire stitched the sky. Oil spread across the sea and ignited, turning blue water black and burning. Sailors jumped overboard only to surface screaming as the water itself caught fire around them. From above, American gunners watched in stunned silence. Ships were exploding everywhere. Smoke columns climbed thousands of feet into the sky. What had been a disciplined formation minutes earlier was now a spinning mass of wreckage fire and men fighting the impossible. The entire battle lasted less than 15 minutes. When the last B-25s pulled away, the guns finally falling silent, the Bismarck Sea was unrecognizable. The convoy was gone, reduced to sinking hulls, floating debris, and a silence broken only by flames and distant cries. For Admiral Kimura, standing amid the destruction, one truth was now undeniable. The old rules of war were dead. When the last American aircraft vanished over the southern horizon, the Bismarck Sea fell into a silence more terrifying than the gunfire. Burning oil crackled across the surface. Wreckage drifted aimlessly. Where a perfectly ordered convoy had sailed minutes earlier, there was now only fire smoke and men in the water. Admiral Kimura stood amid the devastation, surrounded by heat and ash, struggling to comprehend what had happened. 15 minutes. That was all it had taken. 8 transports and 4 destroyers were either sinking or already gone. Thousands of soldiers, men who had been singing and writing letters at dawn, were now trapped below decks or thrashing in a sea that burned them alive. Survivors leapt from ships only to surface in flames. Others clung to floating debris, their uniforms soaked in oil, their voices hoarse from screaming. Some were dragged under by the suction of sinking hulls. Others vanished as secondary explosions ripped through ammunition holds. The sea itself seemed to rise and fall with each detonation, flipping lifeboats and bodies alike. Rescue attempts were desperate and chaotic. Damaged destroyers threw ropes and nets over their sides, pulling aboard the wounded with hands slick from blood and fuel. There were no bandages, no morphine. Sailors tore their own shirts into strips as the injured lay moaning on steel decks that were still hot from fire. Then the attackers returned. Low-flying strafers swept back across the wreckage, guns flashing again, not at ships, but at anything that still moved. Lifeboats shattered. Men in the water dove beneath the surface, choosing drowning over bullets and fire. For those who survived the first wave, hope died with the sound of the engines returning. By midday, sharks had begun to circle. Drawn by blood and vibration, they moved through oil-slicked water as survivors watched in helpless terror. Screams were cut short. One by one, voices disappeared. By nightfall, the convoy was gone. Of the nearly 7,000 soldiers who had left port, fewer than 1,200 would ever see land again. The rest were claimed by steel fire and sea. And as darkness settled over the Bismarck Sea, it became clear that this was not just a defeat, it was a warning. War had changed, and nothing that sailed in daylight would ever be safe again. When the first radio reports reached Rabaul, disbelief spread faster than panic. Officers read the message twice, then a third time, as if repetition might change the meaning. 8 transports destroyed, 4 destroyers lost, thousands dead. The convoy erased in a single daylight attack. Nothing like it had ever happened to the Imperial Japanese Navy. Not at night. Not by submarines. Not like this. The silence that followed was heavier than any explosion. In Tokyo, the report reached the highest levels of command. The language was blunt. No heroic phrasing. No tactical excuses. The truth was unavoidable. The sea lanes were no longer theirs. The doctrine that had protected Japan's empire for 2 years, speed formation, the umbrella of steel, had failed catastrophically. What shattered it was not a new battleship or a larger fleet, but aircraft flying so low they turned the ocean itself into a weapon. Emergency meetings were called. Maps were unrolled. Red circles spread across the South Pacific, marking the growing reach of Allied air power. Every major convoy route now lay within range of B-25 strafers. The conclusion came quickly and mercilessly. Moving supplies by day was suicide. The order went out across the fleet: no more daylight convoys. Troop transports were abandoned. Large formations were scrapped overnight. Instead, supplies would move in darkness: small ships, barges, submarines slipping along coastlines under moonless skies. It was a desperate improvisation, later known as the night run. It kept some units alive, but it could never replace what had been lost. An empire built on movement had been forced to crawl. The consequences rippled outward. Japanese garrisons in New Guinea and the Solomons began to starve. Ammunition ran short. Medicine disappeared. Malaria and hunger killed more men than enemy bullets. The defeat at the Bismarck Sea was not just the loss of ships, it was the death of logistics, the collapse of mobility, the moment momentum slipped away for good. For the Americans, the victory was quiet. No parades, no headlines at home. But among pilots and mechanics, the lesson was clear. Innovation had won. Improvisation had broken tradition. A handful of men in dusty hangars had changed the rules of naval warfare forever. The Pacific was no longer a battlefield of fleets and formations. It had become a hunting ground. And after the Bismarck Sea, the hunters ruled the daylight. In the months that followed, the shock of the Bismarck Sea never faded, it spread. Every Japanese sailor who stepped onto a transport afterward carried the memory of what had happened in daylight. Crews whispered about it below decks. Officers avoided speaking its name aloud. The sea had betrayed them, and everyone knew it could do so again without warning. Convoys that once sailed proudly beneath the sun now crept through darkness. Lights were blacked out. Radios stayed silent. Ships hugged coastlines like criminals preying clouds, and night would hide them from the sky. Even then, fear traveled faster than fuel. At the first rumor of aircraft engines, men froze. Some swore they could hear the guns before they saw the planes, a deep, rolling roar that meant death was already seconds away. Reports from survivors painted the same picture again and again. The attackers appeared without warning. Too low, too fast, too close. Gunfire like machinery tearing itself apart. Ships exploding from the inside. Officers admitted their men broke at the sight of low-flying bombers, courage drowned by memory. Sailors began calling the B-25 the eight-eyed demon, convinced it could see them even in darkness. Inside Japanese headquarters, analysts searched desperately for answers. Charts and doctrines were rewritten, but the conclusion was brutal in its simplicity. The enemy did not fight as expected. He adapted faster than tradition could respond. Discipline and bravery were no longer enough. The battlefield had become industrial, improvisational, unforgiving. For the Americans, the lesson hardened into doctrine. The B-25 strafer was no longer an experiment. It was a solution. Production increased. Tactics spread. Other squadrons learned to fly lower strike faster and vanish before defenses could react. The skies over the Pacific became a place of sudden violence where control belonged not to fleets, but to whoever could think and move first. The balance of the war shifted quietly, almost invisibly, beneath the surface of strategy maps. Japan still fought, still resisted. But something essential had been lost, the freedom to move, to supply, to breathe. From that point on, every mile of ocean was hostile. Every voyage was a gamble against innovation. The Bismarck Sea had not just destroyed a convoy, it had exposed a future where adaptation ruled and hesitation meant extinction. And in that future, the sound of engines low over the water became the last warning many would ever hear. Years later, long after the fires on the Bismarck Sea had gone cold, the meaning of that day became impossible to ignore. What happened in those 15 minutes did not stay buried with the wrecks, it rewrote the war. Japanese planners no longer asked how to win battles. They asked where the Americans were not. Large surface movements vanished. Fleets hid by day and moved like ghosts by night. An empire that once ruled the Pacific now survived by avoiding it. The Americans drew the opposite lesson. Speed mattered more than size. Ideas mattered more than tradition. The strafer became a symbol not of brute force, but of thinking faster than the enemy. Factories adopted field modifications. New variants carried even more forward firepower. Pilots stopped talking about bombing runs and started talking about hunts. Airfields, harbors, convoys, nothing was safe if it could be reached low and fast. The sound became legend. Japanese sailors said it first as a warning, then as a curse, the roar of guns that didn't chatter but screamed. To hear it meant you were already too late. To see the aircraft meant you were already dead. Courage didn't vanish, but it was drowned by memory. No drill could prepare men for an enemy that arrived inside their reaction time. Across the Pacific, attacks multiplied. New Guinea, New Britain, the Solomons. The pattern repeated with brutal efficiency, sudden appearance, blinding fire ships breaking apart from within. Logistics collapsed under the weight of constant interruption. Hunger and disease finished what bombs began. The war did not end in one place, it bled out everywhere. Historians would later argue over weapons and numbers, but the veterans knew the truth. The decisive blow wasn't steel or caliber. It was adaptation. A handful of men in a dusty hangar had proven that invention itself could be a weapon, and that once unleashed, it could not be put back. When the wrecks finally settled beneath coral and silt, the sea grew quiet again. Sunlight returned. Fish swam through rusted corridors where men once stood screaming. Above the surface, the Pacific looked unchanged. But beneath it lay the moment war became something colder, faster, and relentless. The Bismarck Sea was not just a battle. It was the moment the future arrived, low over the water, guns blazing, and impossible to stop. The legacy of the Bismarck Sea did not end when the smoke cleared. It traveled forward in time, carried by the idea that an aircraft could be more than a delivery system, it could become the weapon. What began as desperation in a sweltering hangar became doctrine, then inheritance. In the years that followed, American engineers and pilots kept asking the same dangerous question: what if we push it further? The answer echoed through later wars. Transport planes returned to the battlefield not as lifelines, but as executioners. Side-firing guns turned slow aircraft into floating fortresses. Fire no longer fell from above, and it swept sideways, precise and merciless, pinning enemies to the earth with mechanical certainty. The strafer's DNA lived on in every gunship that stalked the night. But among the men who had flown the first B-25s, there was no triumph in the memory. They remembered the sea on fire, the ships breaking apart, men leaping into water that burned them alive. Major Ed Larner would later stand in museums staring at polished aircraft hanging silent from ceilings and say nothing for a long time. The planes no longer screamed, but he still heard them. On the other side of the ocean, the lesson cut just as deep. Japanese naval cadets studied the battle not as a failure of courage, but of imagination. Tradition had not saved them. Discipline had not saved them. The enemy had learned faster. And in modern war, speed of thought mattered more than honor or numbers. Today, the Bismarck Sea is calm again. Coral grows over twisted steel. Fish drift through passageways where soldiers once waited for orders that never came. Above, the waves roll gently, giving no sign of what lies beneath. But the wrecks are still there. So is the lesson. Innovation wins wars, but it always leaves ghosts. The strafer proved that necessity could turn mechanics into architects of history. It also proved something darker, that once invention is unleashed, it does not choose sides. It only accelerates destruction. And on March 3, 1943, in 15 minutes of fire and noise, the world crossed a line it would never step back from. Long after the war ended, when uniforms were folded away and the Pacific returned to blue silence, the truth of the Bismarck Sea refused to fade. Veterans from both sides spoke of it with the same uneasy pause, not as a victory, not as a defeat, but as a moment when war itself changed shape. The B-25 strafer had begun as an act of survival. No grand strategy, no blueprint. Just men working faster than death welding steel and loading guns because waiting meant losing. Yet that urgency revealed something deeper. In modern war, invention was no longer support, it was the front line. Whoever adapted first would decide who lived long enough to adapt again. That lesson echoed forward. New aircraft were built around the same idea: durability over elegance, firepower over tradition. Planes designed not to intimidate, but to endure, to stay low, to stay close, to finish the fight face to face. The philosophy born over the Bismarck Sea resurfaced again and again, each time deadlier, each time more refined. But progress carried a shadow. For every engineer who admired the brilliance, there were survivors who remembered the cost. The sound of guns that never paused. The sight of ships opening like torn flesh. The sea burning. Innovation had shortened wars, but it had also deepened the abyss they fell into. Speed left no room for mercy. Precision left no room for escape. Major Pappy Gunn never lived to see how far his idea traveled. When he died years later, a note was found among his papers. It read simply, "We built them fast because men were dying faster." There was no pride in it, only necessity. Today, the wrecks still rest beneath the Bismarck Sea, pierced with neat circular holes where bullets once passed. Coral softens the steel. Fish move through shadows of corridors and gun mounts. From above, the water looks peaceful. It always does. But beneath the surface lies the moment humanity learned something it could never forget, that creativity can be as lethal as any weapon, and once unleashed, it changes everything. The sea keeps its secrets. History remembers the sound. Standing on the shores of Papua New Guinea today, it's almost impossible to imagine what happened here. The Bismarck Sea looks endless and calm, its surface broken only by wind and light. No smoke, no fire, no sound of engines tearing the air apart. And yet beneath those gentle waves lies a frozen moment, steel hulls, split open corridors, punched through by bullets, and the remains of men who never saw land again. Divers who later found the wrecks were stunned by what time could not erase. The ships were not torn apart by massive explosions alone. Their hulls were drilled through with hundreds of clean, circular holes, each one the unmistakable mark of a .50 caliber round. Even decades underwater, the evidence was undeniable. This was not destruction from above. It was execution at point-blank range. For the Americans, the battle became legend. Proof that imagination could overpower doctrine. That a handful of mechanics and pilots working in a dusty hangar with no permission but necessity could alter the course of a global war. The B-25 Strafer was no longer just an aircraft. It was a philosophy: adapt fast, strike hard, leave nothing time to react. For Japan, the memory carried a different weight. The Bismarck Sea entered naval education as a warning written in blood. Tradition without adaptation was a liability. Courage without flexibility was not enough. The sea they once ruled had become a prison watched by an enemy that learned faster than they could think. War moved on. New weapons replaced old ones. New battlefields claimed new lives. But the lesson endured. Progress in war is never neutral. Every breakthrough shortens the distance between decision and death. Today, coral grows where fire once burned. Fish drift through gun mounts and passageways. Above it all, the sea gives nothing away. But history remembers. The Bismarck Sea was not just where ships were lost. It was where the future of warfare revealed itself, low, fast, merciless. And once seen, it could never be unseen. The men who built the Strafer never set out to change history. They were not chasing glory or legacy. They were racing a clock measured in lives. Every convoy that slipped through meant another beach soaked in blood, another jungle filled with graves. So they worked faster than doctrine, faster than permission, faster than the war itself. And for a brief, violent moment, they won that race. But victory carried a weight that never lifted. Pilots who survived the Bismarck Sea rarely spoke about it in detail. When they did, their voices slowed. They remembered the way ships seemed to open up under fire, the way the sea burned, the way the noise followed them home long after the engines shut down. One veteran said the worst part wasn't the attack. It was the silence afterward, when the guns stopped and there was nothing left to shoot, only men in the water. For Japan, the lesson cut even deeper. The Imperial Navy did not lose because its sailors lacked courage. They lost because the world had changed faster than their beliefs. The Bismarck Sea proved that tradition, no matter how disciplined, could be outpaced by invention. From that day forward, Japanese strategy became defensive, cautious, haunted by the memory of aircraft that arrived inside the margin of human reaction. The Strafer itself became both symbol and warning. In museums, it hangs clean and silent, its aluminum skin polished, its guns inert. Visitors admire its lines, its ingenuity. But those who know its story hear something else, the echo of 8 machine guns firing as one, the sound that meant there was no time left. War did not end with the Bismarck Sea. It only accelerated. Factories turned ideas into weapons. Weapons turned minutes into massacres. The distance between thought and destruction grew shorter with every innovation. What began in a dusty hangar became a template for modern war: adapt or disappear. Today, the ocean above the wrecks is calm. Sunlight ripples across the surface. The past feels far away. But beneath the waves, steel still lies where it fell, and history waits quietly unchanged. The battle did not just destroy ships. It revealed a truth the world has lived with ever since. In war, invention is unstoppable, and once unleashed, it never asks who must pay. On the morning of March 3, 1943, the Bismarck Sea kept its secret. It looked the same as it always had, calm blue, indifferent. By nightfall, it had become a graveyard, and beneath its surface something far more lasting than wreckage had settled. The battle proved that war no longer belonged to the biggest fleet or the strongest armor. It belonged to whoever learned fastest, whoever dared to break their own rules first. In 15 minutes, tradition drowned, and a new age surfaced, one where machines were reshaped in the field. Tactics rewritten mid-war, and survival depended on imagination as much as courage. The B-25 Strafer was never meant to be elegant. It was brutal, improvised, and unforgiving, just like the war that created it. 8 gun barrels pointing forward, no hesitation, no warning. It did not ask permission from doctrine. It erased it. For the men who sailed that morning, the sea became the enemy. For the men who flew low over the waves, it became a weapon. And for the world watching afterward, the message was unmistakable. Modern war would be decided not by tradition, but by adaptation. Today, the Bismarck Sea is quiet again. Coral grows over steel. Sunlight dances where fire once burned. But history has not moved on. It waits beneath the waves, reminding us that progress in war is never clean, and innovation always leaves a shadow. What happened here was not just a battle. It was the moment the future arrived, flying low, thinking fast, and impossible to stop.
At 9:27 a.m., one American fighter was accidentally late for the war. Second Lieutenant Philip Adair looked down from the cockpit of his P-40 and realized something had gone very wrong. 64 Japanese aircraft were heading straight for his airfield. He was alone. No backup, no plan B. Just 12 seconds of ammo and a very bad morning to be the only guy awake. 8 weeks earlier, Japanese bombers had learned a simple trick over northeast India: show up early, catch Allied airfields asleep, and burn everything that didn't move. 47 transport planes destroyed, 112 men killed. Most of them never even heard an engine before the bombs hit. This morning, Denjan Airfield was next. Below Adair's wing sat 14 C-47 transports fully loaded with supplies bound for China. Fuel stockpiles stacked like tinder. A field hospital treating wounded soldiers who definitely did not sign up to be bombed in their beds. If those bombers made it through the hump airlift, would be dead for weeks. Chiang Kai-shek's army would feel it. Everyone would feel it. And standing between all of that and 64 enemy aircraft was one guy named Phil. His P-40, nicknamed Lulu Bell, carried 6 .50 caliber machine guns and just enough ammunition for 12 seconds of sustained fire. 12 seconds. That wasn't a lot of time to save a war. It barely qualified as a long sneeze. The enemy formation was textbook Japanese precision. 24 bombers flying tight and level, wrapped in nearly 40 nimble fighters above and below, like angry wasps guarding a picnic basket. Intelligence said raids this size hit their targets 90% of the time, especially when no one showed up to stop them. Standard doctrine was very clear on situations like this. Do not engage when outnumbered more than 5 to 1. Phil Adair was outnumbered 64-1. The nearest friendly fighters were 38 minutes away. By then, Denjon would be a smoking memory. Adair checked his fuel. Full tanks, 90 minutes of flight time. He checked his guns, loaded. He checked the sky again. No help was coming. He could shadow them, call it in, and watch his airfield disappear. Or he could do something incredibly stupid immediately. Phil pushed the throttle forward, because if you're going to have a bad morning, you might as well make it memorable. The throttle went forward, and the P-40 answered like it had been waiting for permission all morning. The Allison engine roared, the nose dipped, and Phil Adair pointed his fighter straight at the largest group of enemy aircraft he had ever seen outside a training manual titled "Things You Should Never Do." Airspeed climbed past 300 miles per hour. The wind screamed around the cockpit. Gravity pressed him into the seat. He climbed above the formation first, because if you're going to do something suicidal, altitude helps. 4,000 feet above the bombers, Phil rolled the P-40 onto its back. Below him, the Japanese formation droned along calmly, neat and confident, already thinking about breakfast after the bombing run. None of them looked up. That was the problem with success. It made people careless. Phil lined up the lead bomber group, 6 aircraft flying in a perfect V. Knock out the leaders, break the formation, ruin the aim. He ignored the fighters for now. They could wait their turn. He pushed the stick forward and dove. The P-40 fell out of the sky like it had been kicked by God. Speed, built fast, 350, 360, the engine howled. The bombers filled his windscreen. At 800 yards, Phil squeezed the trigger. 650 caliber machine guns opened up at once. The cockpit shook like a washing machine full of bricks. Tracers reached out and stitched across the lead bomber's wing. Fabric tore, metal sparked. Then the left engine caught fire in a bright orange flash. That bomber didn't like being on fire. The formation exploded apart. Aircraft broke left and right, pilots yanking controls. Bombers scattering in every direction. Precision dissolved into panic in less than 2 seconds. Phil pulled up hard 7 Gs, crushing him into the seat, just as 40 Japanese fighters realized they had a serious problem behind them. Because now they weren't escorting bombers anymore. They were chasing a very angry American who had just ruined their entire day. And Phil Adair was already lining up for another pass. The sky suddenly stopped being empty. 40 Nakajima Ki-43 Oscars rolled in from above and behind their wings, flashing in the sun. Sleek, lightweight, built for turning fights. The kind of airplanes that loved nothing more than chewing up heavy American fighters that made the mistake of slowing down. And Phil Adair knew exactly one rule about Oscars: never turn with them, ever. The P-40 was faster in a straight line, tougher, heavier. The Oscars were dancers. If Phil tried to dogfight, this would be over fast and unpleasant. The first 4 came down from his 10 o'clock high. Phil rolled left, snapped the nose up, fired a quick burst, missed. No surprise there. He wasn't trying to kill them. He was trying to make them blink. They blinked. The lead Oscar broke, right its wingman following. Phil immediately dove away, trading altitude for speed. The P-40 surged forward, the airframe shuddering as it pushed past 380 miles per hour. The Oscars tried to follow, but they couldn't keep up. Good. That bought him seconds. Not safety, seconds. Behind him, the bombers were trying to pull themselves back together. 3 neat little V formations started forming again, like nothing had happened. Like they hadn't just watched one of their friends catch fire and fall out of the sky. Phil glanced at his ammo counter. 800 rounds left. Maybe 6 good attacks if he was careful. Careful wasn't really an option. He shoved the throttle forward again and dove straight back toward the bombers. 8 Oscars followed him down close enough that he could almost feel their breath. The P-40 screamed through the dive, hitting over 400 miles per hour. The Oscars fell behind. Phil leveled out at bomber altitude and lined up on the right-hand formation. 300 yards, 200. He fired. Tracers slammed into the lead bomber's engine. The radial exploded in a fireball, pieces flying off like shrapnel. The bomber rolled violently. Its wingman yanked away to avoid collision. The formation shattered again. Phil kicked rudder, sprayed another burst through a bomber's thin fuselage, then pulled up hard as the Oscars came screaming back in. The sky was chaos now. Smoke, fire, fighters everywhere. And somehow, against all common sense, one American fighter was still in the middle of it, refusing to leave. Phil Adair wasn't winning, but he was making sure nobody else was either. That's when the airplane started arguing back. Phil felt it before he saw it. The engine temperature needle creeping past where it politely belonged, then past where it was supposed to be, then into the area usually labeled, "Congratulations, you broke it." He had been running full power for 11 straight minutes. The Allison engine could take that for about 20. Today, it was not feeling generous. The bombers were still coming, 19 miles out, close enough to ruin everyone's week. Phil shoved the nose down again and dove through the escort. The P-40 ripped past 390 miles per hour, shaking like it wanted to complain to maintenance. He leveled out and fired at the lead bomber. The right wing folded like cardboard. The aircraft flipped and vanished in a spiral. No parachutes. Good news, the formation broke again. Bad news. 12 Oscars were now very motivated. Rounds snapped past his canopy. Fabric tore off his wing. The control stick went slightly soft in his right hand. That was new. The coolant gauge hit 240 degrees. The engine started to vibrate, a low, ugly shudder that said something important was coming apart inside. Phil had 3 choices: pull power and cool the engine turn for home, or keep fighting and let physics file a complaint later. He kept the throttle forward. 2 Oscars came straight at him head-on, closing at over 600 miles an hour. Tracers flashed. Phil fired first. His heavier rounds punched into one fighter's engine. White vapor poured out. The Oscar broke away suddenly, uninterested in continuing the conversation. The temperature needle climbed higher. Then a round punched through his fuselage. Another through the engine cowling. Green coolant sprayed across the windscreen like bad windshield washer fluid. The engine temperature went off the scale. Steam burst from the cowling. Oil pressure dropped. The Allison was dying. Phil chopped the throttle just enough to keep it alive. Not to save the engine, just to borrow it a little longer. Below him, the bombers were scattering for good now, turning away, breaking south. The raid was over. The airfield was safe. Phil finally turned toward home. Behind him, the engine burned. Ahead of him, 40 miles of jungle waited patiently. And the P-40 kept flying, mostly out of stubbornness. The engine fire didn't care that the mission was over. Phil smelled it first. Burning metal, burning coolant. Then smoke crept into the cockpit, thin at first, then thick enough to sting his eyes. The Allison was running on borrowed time, and it knew it. Oil pressure dropped to 0. 0 is not a warning. 0 is an obituary. The propeller began to shudder unevenly, like it was deciding whether today was the day it simply left. Airspeed bled off. 180 miles per hour. 160. The jungle below looked very patient. 6 Oscars followed him, circling above like sharks that had already decided dessert could wait. One slid in close, so close Phil could see the pilot's face. The Japanese pilot pointed downward. Land. Bail out. Surrender. Phil ignored him. Then the cockpit filled with smoke, not from the engine, but from behind the instrument panel. Electrical wiring. Another thing he didn't need on his list. His eyes burned. His throat closed. He slid the canopy open, letting wind rip the smoke out and nearly his head with it. At 4,000 feet, something snapped. The right aileron went limp. The P-40 rolled hard right and pitched down. Phil pulled back. Nothing happened. The elevator cables were gone. Great. Now the airplane had officially stopped listening. The nose dropped. Airspeed climbed fast. 200, 250. The jungle rushed up like it had somewhere important to be. Phil had seconds. Then something clicked, not in the airplane, but in his head. The damage was forcing him down right side up, but aerodynamics didn't care about orientation. If the controls were killing him upright, maybe they'd save him upside down. At 1,800 feet, Phil rolled the P-40 inverted. Negative G slammed him into the straps. Blood rushed to his head. The engine coughed, starved for fuel, then somehow kept running. And just like that, the nose came up. The descent slowed. He was flying upside down, climbing. Barely, but climbing. So Phil did the only thing that made sense. He kept flipping the airplane like a lunatic. Inverted to climb. Upright to feed fuel. Flip, climb, flip, descend. Over and over. Above him, the Oscars watched. Then they turned away. Whatever that American was doing, they wanted no part of it. Phil Adair flew home upside down, not because it was smart, but because quitting wasn't on the checklist. By the time Naguli Airfield appeared on the horizon, Phil Adair wasn't flying anymore. He was negotiating. The engine was a ruin. Oil pressure had been 0 for 9 minutes, 9 minutes longer than physics normally allows. The temperature gauge had given up completely. The needle had literally melted off. Smoke still poured from the cowling, but the flames had burned themselves out. Either the fire had run out of fuel, or the engine had run out of reasons to care. Then Phil remembered one small detail: landing gear. The P-40's gear was hydraulic. Hydraulics needed engine power, and the engine was barely pretending to be alive. If he dropped the gear too early and the engine quit, he'd crash short. If he didn't drop it at all, a belly landing would turn the remaining fuel into a fireball. Simple problem, terrible timing. Phil reached for the gear lever. Nothing happened. Of course nothing happened. The hydraulic pump wasn't getting enough pressure. The gear stayed locked up, smug and useless. But the P-40 had a backup, a manual hand pump. 28 strokes. Easy if you had 2 hands. Phil had one hand on the stick. Let go and the damaged controls would shove the nose down into the jungle. So he improvised. He loosened his lap belt, wrapped it around the control stick, looped it through the seat frame, and cinched it tight. Not great flying, but technically flying. Then he grabbed the pump with both hands and went to work. 5 strokes, 10, 15. His arms burned, his vision tunneled. Carbon monoxide was chewing on his brain like a bored animal. At stroke 23, resistance. At 28, thunk. One wheel dropped, then the other. Gear down. Drag skyrocketed. Airspeed fell to 135 miles per hour, barely above stall. The runway was 7 miles away, 3 minutes. Phil focused on the concrete strip ahead. He didn't need perfect, he just needed enough. The engine sputtered again. And this time, it didn't catch. The propeller slowed, then stopped. Silence. The P-40 became a glider. A very bad one. 2 miles from the runway, Phil realized the truth. He wasn't going to make it. Unless he rolled the airplane inverted. One last time. Because at this point, why stop doing the impossible now? Flying inverted without an engine is not something pilots are trained to do. It's something they discover when they're out of good options. At 1,800 feet, 1 mile from the runway, Phil held the P-40 upside down and watched the airspeed settle at 125 miles per hour. Better than before. Less drag, less sink. Somehow, physics was still cooperating barely. Blood rushed to his head. His vision turned red, then gray around the edges. Carbon monoxide and negative G's were now working together, and neither of them was friendly. He counted seconds in his head, knowing he didn't have many. Below him, above him, the runway slid closer. On the ground, the tower watched in disbelief as an upside-down P-40 approached with its landing gear extended. That was not standard procedure. A crew chief named Robert Martinez grabbed binoculars and immediately assumed the worst. Maybe the Japanese had stolen an American fighter. Maybe it was about to strafe the field. Martinez ran for a .50 caliber gun. Phil didn't know any of that. He just knew he had to roll upright at exactly the right moment. Too early, and the damaged controls would shove him into the jungle. Too late, and he'd overshoot the runway and crash anyway. At 400 feet, his vision started to tunnel. 200 feet, 300 yards from the threshold. Now. Phil rolled the P-40 upright. The airplane immediately tried to kill him. The damaged aileron dropped the right wing. The nose pitched down. Phil fought the controls with everything he had left, hauling back, forcing the wings level by pure muscle and stubbornness. The runway rushed up fast, too fast. The P-40 crossed the threshold at 90 feet, descending hard. 4 seconds later, the wheels hit. The impact was violent. 7 Gs slammed through the airframe. The gear compress screamed, then the right main gear collapsed. The wingtip struck concrete. Sparks exploded, and the aircraft spun sideways in a shower of metal and fire. It skidded backward 200 feet and stopped. Silence. Smoke billowed from the engine compartment. For 12 seconds, Phil Adair didn't move. Then he unstrapped, stood up, and climbed out onto the wing just as his legs gave out. Ground crew caught him before gravity could finish the job. The P-40 was destroyed, but the runway was intact. The airfield was safe. And against every reasonable expectation, the pilot was still alive. The fire crews reached the wreck just as Phil's boots hit the ground. Someone grabbed his arm. Someone else yelled for a medic. Phil didn't hear most of it. His ears rang. The world felt slow, distant, like he was watching it through thick glass. He stared back at the airplane, or what was left of it. Lulu Bell looked like she'd gone 12 rounds with a buzzsaw and lost. The engine cowling was peeled back. Pistons seized. The crankshaft warped. Coolant and oil everywhere. The Allison hadn't just failed, it had sacrificed itself with enthusiasm. Mechanics would later count the damage: 16 bullet holes in the fuselage, 11 more in the wings, control cables cut clean through. 1 round had missed Phil's head by inches. The airplane would never fly again. Phil nodded. as if the wreck had personally apologized to him. Fair enough. Medical officers examined him 3 days later and stared at the results like they were misprinted. Carbon monoxide levels in his blood were still dangerously high 72 hours after the mission. According to medical textbooks, he should have been unconscious long before reaching the runway. According to reality, he had flown inverted for 11 minutes, landed upside down, and walked away. Intelligence reports filled in the rest of the story. Every Japanese bomber had turned back. Not a single bomb had fallen on Denjon. 14 C-47 transports were still intact. The hump airlift never missed a day. 1 pilot, 1 fighter, 64 enemy aircraft. On January 8, 1944, Lieutenant General Joseph Stilwell pinned the Silver Star on Philadelphia's uniform. The citation used words like gallantry and extraordinary heroism. Phil probably just remembered it as a very long morning. He flew 95 more combat missions, became an ace, survived the war, retired a colonel, lived a full life. The P-40 never became famous. It wasn't fast enough. It wasn't pretty enough. But on one December morning in 1943, an obsolete fighter and a stubborn young pilot proved something timeless. Sometimes history doesn't turn on numbers. Sometimes it turns on one man refusing to quit, even when the airplane already has. History loves clean victories, big formations, perfect plans, machines working exactly as designed. December 13th, 1943 was none of those things. There was no grand strategy in the sky over Assam that morning. No overwhelming force, no flawless execution. Just one tired American pilot in an airplane everyone had quietly agreed was past its prime, doing a job it was never meant to do far longer than it was supposed to survive. The P-40 Warhawk would never get the glory of sleeker fighters that came later. It couldn't climb high enough. It couldn't turn tight enough. By 1943, most pilots called it adequate, which is a polite way of saying, we wish we had something better. But adequacy in the right hands can become something else entirely. Philip Adair didn't win because his airplane was superior. He won because he refused to accept the moment when the story was supposed to end. When doctrine said, disengage, he attacked. When the engine overheated, he kept flying. When the controls failed, he turned the airplane upside down. When physics objected, he argued back. The Burma Banshees would go on to destroy hundreds of enemy aircraft. Many wouldn't come home. Their skull insignia became a warning in the skies over Burma and India, but one morning, one pilot carried that entire legacy alone. 14 transport planes remained intact. A supply line stayed alive. A hospital full of wounded men slept through the night instead of dying in their beds. And somewhere in the jungle below, 64 enemy aircraft turned away, confused, frustrated, and very aware that something had gone terribly wrong. Wars aren't decided only by generals or machines. Sometimes they hinge on a single moment when one person looks at impossible odds and says, yeah, I'll handle it. Philip Adair did, and the war noticed. Everyone thought the story ended on the runway. The smoking wreck, the hero walking away, the medal, the happy ending. That's the version that fits neatly in history books. But weeks later, intelligence officers noticed something strange. Japanese radio intercepts from Burma mention the mission, not as a defeat, not as a loss, as a mystery. Pilots reported being attacked by multiple American fighters. They described relentless dives, repeated attacks from impossible angles. Some swore the same aircraft appeared above them again and again, sometimes right side up, sometimes upside down, refusing to die. Japanese commanders believed they had flown into a trap. They delayed future raids, changed routes, increased escorts. For weeks, airfields across northeast India were left alone, not because they were well defended, but because the enemy thought something unnatural guarded them. Only later did analysts realize the truth. There was never a squadron. There was never backup. There was one airplane, one pilot, one man flying so aggressively, so unpredictably, that an entire formation of 64 aircraft believed they were facing a coordinated defense. Philip Adair hadn't just saved an airfield. He had accidentally invented psychological warfare at 20,000 feet. The irony Adair never knew. He thought he'd barely survived. The enemy thought they'd escaped something far worse. And somewhere in the gap between those two beliefs, the legend was born. Because the most terrifying weapon in war isn't always firepower. Sometimes it's a human being who simply refuses to behave logically. War doesn't end with applause. It doesn't fade out with music or freeze on a heroic pose. Most of the time, it ends quietly. After the reports were filed, the wreckage cleared, and the medals pinned the sky, over Assam simply returned to business as usual. Aircraft took off. Supplies kept moving. Another day inside a war too large to notice one man's survival. Philip Adair went back to flying. He rarely talked about that morning, not because it wasn't important, but because to him, it didn't feel like a story. It felt like a checklist that went wrong, followed by a series of decisions made faster than fear could form. He flew 95 more missions. He shot down enemy aircraft. He lived long enough to become something rare in wartime aviation, an old pilot. Years later, people would ask him how he did it, how he attacked alone, how he flew upside down, how an engine with no oil kept running. Adair usually shrugged and said the airplane just kept flying. That wasn't entirely true. Airplanes don't make choices. They don't refuse to quit. They don't argue with physics or decide that today is not the day. People do. The P-40 Warhawk never became a legend. It never got a movie, a parade, or a place in popular memory. It was replaced, retired, and quietly forgotten. But on one December morning in 1943, it carried something more important than speed or firepower. It carried a human being who would not let go. History remembers battles. It remembers numbers and outcomes and victory maps with arrows drawn across them. But sometimes, rarely, it remembers a moment when one person stood alone between disaster and survival and simply said no. No to the odds. No to the math. No to the ending that was supposed to happen. Philip Adair didn't change the war. He changed one morning. And for the people who lived because of it, that was enough. Fade out. At 30,000 feet over Budapest, a single explosion erased the nose of a B-17 bomber, along with its cockpit instruments and 2 crewmen. No controls, no gauges, just freezing wind and exposed steel cables. What followed was 10 minutes of flight that physics said was impossible. The bomber was called Mispa, a B-17G flying fortress assigned to the 483rd Bomb Group flying out of southern Italy. In the left seat, sat First Lieutenant Ewald Swanson, 24 years old, 17 combat missions behind him, and no margin left for mistakes. On the morning of July 14, 1944, his orders were brutally simple: fly straight into the heart of German-controlled Budapest, drop 2 tons of bombs on rail yards, feeding the Eastern Front, and make it home. But bomber crews knew the truth. The briefing rooms never said out loud. By mid-1944, statistics ruled the sky. Out of every 10 men who climbed into a B-17, only 2 would finish their tour. The others would die, be captured, or vanish without a trace. At 9:42 a.m., black bursts of flak began blooming ahead, thick, violent, perfectly timed. More than 200 German guns were firing up at them. Aluminum shuddered. Shrapnel tore through wings and fuselage. Still, Mizpah held formation. Seconds from the target, the bomb bay doors opened. The payload dropped away. And then, in a flash, brighter than lightning, the war reached up and tore the airplay. The explosion didn't just damage Mizpah, it erased it. Everything forward of the cockpit was gone. The bombardier station, the navigator's table, the Norden bomb site, the plexiglass nose vaporized in a heartbeat. Kenneth Dudley and Joe Henderson never felt pain. 1 second they were alive. The next, they were simply gone. Cold air at 40 below zero screamed into the open cavity. Blood sprayed across the flight deck. Swanson looked forward and saw sky where instruments should have been. There was no control yoke, no altimeter, no airspeed indicator, no artificial horizon. The entire instrument panel had been bolted to a section of airplane that no longer existed. The B-17 pitched violently upward as its center of gravity shifted. Without the weight of the nose, the bomber clawed toward a vertical climb, bleeding airspeed seconds from a stall that would flip it backward and tear it apart. Swanson had nothing to grab, nothing to pull, and yet somehow the aircraft responded. Exposed steel control cables meant to be hidden deep inside the fuselage whipped in the 300-mile-per-hour wind, still intact. Against every rule of engineering, Mizpah was technically flyable. Barely. Boeing never designed a bomber to be flown without a cockpit. No manual covered this. No training prepared anyone for it. Swanson forced the nose down by instinct alone, reading the horizon through a hole large enough to swallow a truck. The bomber leveled out, slipping back into loose formation, like a wounded animal refusing to fall. Then at 9:44 a.m., another 88mm shell found its mark. Engine number 2 exploded in fire and oil. The propeller seized. Now the Flying Fortress was missing its nose and running on 3 engines over enemy territory. Physics was collecting its debt, and the bill was coming due fast. With 1 engine burning and the formation pulling away, Mizpah began to fall behind. Swanson couldn't see the airspeed drop. There were no gauges left to tell him, but he could feel it in his bones. The bomber was heavy wounded and bleeding speed with every second. And then the truth became clear inside the fuselage. The control cables were alive. Elevator rudder, ailerons, steel ropes, as thick as a man's finger, now fully exposed, thrashing in the slipstream. Without resistance, without guidance, the aircraft would tear itself apart. Someone had to hold them. Technical Sergeant Frank Giamenzi, the flight engineer, moved forward first. He saw the cables vibrating, bowing under the force of the wind. Staff Sergeants George Simonelli and Robert Bell followed. There was no order given, no discussion. They understood instantly. If no one grabbed those cables, everyone would die. They wrapped gloved hands around freezing steel. The wind tried to rip the cables away, slicing through fabric, numbing fingers to the bone. When Swanson adjusted throttle, the bomber yawed wild, unpredictable. The men reacted by instinct, pulling left, pulling right, pulling back. And impossibly, it worked. The airplane answered human hands instead of controls. Pull too hard, and it would overcorrect. Let go for a second, and it would spiral. 30 feet apart with no intercom and no instruments, pilot and crew became a single organism, guessing, reacting, surviving. Flak still burst around them. Enemy territory stretched for miles ahead. The formation was gone now, shrinking into the distance. Mizpah was alone, slow and barely controllable. This wasn't flying anymore. It was 10 men wrestling gravity itself, using blood muscle and sheer refusal to quit, while the sky waited for them to fail. The formation didn't slow down. It never did. By doctrine, by survival, bombers that couldn't hold speed were abandoned. And now, Mizpah was bleeding altitude minute by minute over the most dangerous airspace in Europe. 29,000 feet. Then 28. The men pulling the cables felt it before they saw it, the slow, sickening drop of the horizon. Swanson had no fuel gauges, no compass, no navigator. Henderson was dead scattered somewhere over Budapest. All Swanson had left was a direction burned into his mind: southwest. Get out of Hungary, get over Yugoslavia, reach the Adriatic, reach Italy, or don't reach anything at all. Then the tail began to move. Not violently, not yet. Just enough to be wrong. The metal framework flexed under stress it was never meant to endure. Staff Sergeant Charles Tucker felt it first in the tail gun position. The shudder, the unnatural sway. If the tail failed, there would be no spin, no warning, no chance to bail out. The airplane would simply come apart. The men in the bomb bay knew it too. They could see the fuselage skin ripple, stress cracks spreading like veins. They were flying a bomber that was dying by inches. At that moment, the unspoken decision formed. Staying aboard meant certainty. Bailing out meant a chance. Capture prison camps months or years behind wire, but alive. One by one, they let go of the cables. Each release made the aircraft harder to control. Each man who jumped stole a little more stability from the sky. The bomber lurched, wings dipping, nose wandering. Swanson fought it with throttles alone, holding the monster steady for as long as he could. This was leadership stripped bare. One man staying at the controls, not to save the airplane, but to give the others time to live. What no one aboard Mizpah knew, what no one could have known in that moment, was that the bomber was already living on borrowed seconds. When the 88mm shell tore away, the nose shrapnel didn't just kill 2 men. A jagged fragment ripped through the forward fuselage and severed a hydraulic line buried deep in the airframe. Fluid began bleeding out immediately, slow at first, invisible in the chaos. But without hydraulics, the tail surfaces were no longer being supported as designed. The bomber wasn't just damaged, it was decaying in real time. Every second the crew pulled those steel cables, they were fighting a failure already in motion. The tail wasn't weakening because of turbulence. It was collapsing because the structure was no longer being fed pressure. It needed to stay rigid. The aircraft had minutes, maybe less. If Swanson had tried to land, impossible. If they had delayed, bailout fatal. If even one man had hesitated, none would have survived. The terrifying truth is this: the decision to jump wasn't just brave, it was perfectly timed by chance. Another 60 seconds and the tail would have sheared off at altitude. No parachutes, no escape, just silence and fire. The crew never knew how close they were. They never knew they were racing a hidden countdown. They thought they were fighting gravity. In reality, they were outrunning death by seconds. By 9:56 a.m., almost everyone was gone. Parachutes had bloomed beneath the bomber like scattered white scars against the Yugoslav countryside. Each man who jumped took weight with him, weight the airplane no longer had the strength to lose. The control cables now hung slack, snapping uselessly in the wind. Mizpah was no longer being flown. It was merely falling slowly, reluctantly held together by momentum and will. Only two men remained, Swanson in the left seat, Paul Berndt beside him. No words were spoken. None were needed. Berndt knew the truth as clearly as Swanson did. Staying meant dying. The CO pilot had no controls, no instruments, no role left to play. He stood steady despite the vibration tearing through the airframe and made his way aft. 30 seconds later, he was gone. Swanson was alone. One man in a 65,000-pound bomber with no nose, no gauges, no crew, and no future. The aircraft descended through 19,000 feet, engines still roaring, burning fuel at a rate he couldn't measure. Any second they could flame out. Any second the tail could shear away. But Swanson stayed. Not for heroism, not for glory. He stayed to buy time. Time for the men below to land farther from the crash, farther from German patrols. 2 more minutes. That was all he owed them. At 10:00 a.m., he let go. The bomber immediately rolled left nose dropping as gravity finally claimed its prize. Swanson fought the wind clipped on his parachute and jumped into empty air. Behind him, Mizpah plunged on tail, tearing free at 15,000 feet before vanishing into the forest in fire and smoke. The airplane was gone. The crew lived. And in that trade, everything that mattered survived. The silence came first. After the roar of engines and tearing wind, the quiet beneath the parachute felt unreal, like the war had suddenly stepped away. Swanson drifted downward, watching smoke rise from the forest where Mizpah had died. If he'd waited 30 seconds longer, he would have gone with it. The ground rushed up faster than expected. Trees filled his vision. He hit the branches hard, crashing through leaves and limbs before slamming into thick wood. Pain exploded through his left leg. Bones snapped clean. He hung there bleeding, tangled in parachute lines, 15 feet above the ground, fighting not to black out. German voices reached him within minutes. Soldiers emerged from the trees, rifles raised. There was no escape. A ladder was fetched. Hands cut the lines and lowered him carefully. A medic followed, professional, efficient, splinting the broken leg, injecting morphine, stopping the bleeding. The war for Swanson was over. Within days, the rest of the crew was found. Every man who jumped survived, captured, shaken, but alive. They were sent north to a prisoner of war camp. Cold barracks, thin rations, endless waiting. Swanson learned to walk again, on a shattered leg, while months dragged into seasons. They talked about those 10 minutes without a cockpit, about pulling steel cables by hand, about Dudley and Henderson, who never had a chance. In April 1945, American armor finally rolled through Germany. The gates opened. the waiting ended. Swanson went home. He never called himself a hero. He said he was lucky. But luck doesn't hold a bomber together. Men do. Freedom didn't feel like victory. When the gates opened in the spring of 1945, it felt quiet, almost unreal. Swanson and the crew of Mispa walked out thinner, older, changed in ways no uniform could show. The war had taken 10 minutes of their lives and stretched them into a memory that would never loosen its grip. They returned to America as men who had seen the edge. Swanson went back to Michigan, married, raised a family, built a life that looked ordinary from the outside. He rarely spoke about July 14, 1944. When he did, he never talked about bravery. He talked about Dudley, about Henderson, about hands bleeding inside a bomber that should not have been flying. The Army Air Forces called it valor, promoted him, let him retire as a lieutenant colonel. Swanson accepted the rank, but never the label. To him, that day wasn't about heroism. It was about refusing to quit, when quitting would have been easier. The crew stayed in touch. Reunions, handshakes that lasted too long, shared glances that needed no words. They remembered the sound of wind through an open nose, the weight of steel cables cutting into gloves, the moment each man stepped into empty air, trusting someone else to hold the plane together just a little longer. Mispa burned in a Yugoslav forest, erased from the sky. But what flew that day was not aluminum or engines or design. It was cooperation. It was leadership. It was the stubborn American refusal to let physics decide who lives. That's what survived the sky. Time moved on, as it always does. Bombers gave way to jets. Jets gave way to rockets. The sky that once swallowed young men in aluminum machines became quiet again. But 10 minutes over Budapest refused to fade. For the men of Mispa, July 14th never stayed in the past. It lived in small moments, in the sound of wind on a winter night, in the smell of oil and metal, in the way their hands sometimes clenched for no reason at all. They didn't remember fear first. They remember coordination, trust, the unspoken agreement that no one would let go too soon. Dudley and Henderson never aged. They stayed 23 and 24, forever frozen, at the instant the sky took them. The others carried their names forward through captivity, through homecoming, through decades of ordinary American life built on borrowed time. History would record the mission as a line in a ledger. One bomber lost, target hit, crew captured. What history could never measure was what happened inside that airplane after the cockpit vanished. No diagram explains men replacing machines. No equation accounts for leadership that stays behind so others can live. Mispa should not have flown. That crew should not have survived. But war is not decided by blueprints alone. Sometimes it is decided by hands on steel cables, by choices made at 30,000 feet, by the refusal to surrender when gravity demands it. 10 minutes said no. And because of that, 8 men came home and 2 were never forgotten. In the end, Mispa never made it home, but its crew did. 8 men walked away from something that should have erased all of them. Not because the aircraft was strong, but because the people inside it were stronger. War stories often celebrate machines, the horsepower, the armor, the design. But July 14th, 1944 wasn't a victory of engineering. It was a victory of decision, of timing, of men choosing each other over survival instincts, screaming to let go. Evald Swanson lived the rest of his life quietly. No speeches, no medals on the wall. When asked, he said it was luck. But luck doesn't stay at the controls when everyone else jumps. Luck doesn't give up the last chance to live so others can land farther away. That was choice. That was command. Somewhere over Budapest, Vizix tried to end the story. 10 minutes later, men rewrote it. 2 never came home. Their names deserved to be spoken. 8 did and carried that responsibility for the rest of their lives. That is why this story matters. Not because a bomber lost its nose, but because when everything mechanical failed, human will did not. If we forget stories like this, we forget what courage really looks like. Not loud, not dramatic, but stubborn, quiet, and unyielding at 30,000 feet. And as long as these names are remembered, that aircraft never truly fell. Surviving the war didn't end the story, it complicated it. For the men of Mizpah, life after combat carried a different gravity, the weight of knowing exactly how close the sky had come to taking everything. They built careers, raised families, laughed at barbecues and birthdays, yet somewhere beneath the surface lived 10 minutes that never loosened its grip. Evald Swanson carried it silently. He never dramatized what happened above Budapest. He never described himself as brave. When people pressed him, he spoke of teamwork, of timing, of men who did their jobs when quitting would have been easier. And always he spoke of the 2 who never came back. Kenneth Dudley and Joe Henderson, names he carried longer than any rank. Reunions brought the memories back sharp and immediate. A handshake could summon the cold. A shared glance could recall the sound of steel cables screaming in the wind. They didn't talk about fear. They talked about responsibility. About how survival isn't a victory, it's a duty to remember. The world moved on. The bomber Reldi Pibrana rusted into history. But courage like that doesn't belong to museums. It belongs to moments when ordinary people refuse to let others fall alone. At 30,000 feet, Mizpah lost its nose. What it didn't lose was its crew. And as long as this story is told, those 10 minutes still fly. Long after the uniforms were folded away and the war faded into photographs, the legacy of Mizpah remained heavier than steel. Not in archives or official reports, but in the lives that continued because 10 men refused to surrender to inevitability. Evald Swanson lived to see a world transformed. He watched propellers give way to jets, bombers replaced by missiles, and wars fought by machines guided from continents away. Yet nothing ever rivaled those 10 minutes when human hands replaced broken systems and leadership meant staying behind while others escaped. He never chased recognition. Promotions came quietly. Retirement followed. When neighbors asked about the war, he changed the subject. When pressed, he answered simply, "We just did what had to be done." But those words carried the weight of men who understood that survival creates responsibility, to remember, to honor, to speak for those who never returned. Kenneth Dudley and Joe Henderson remain part of every reunion, every toast, every long pause in conversation. They were there in the silence that followed laughter, in the understanding shared only by men who had stared down gravity and won barely. History often remembers victories by territory gained or cities destroyed. But some victories are quieter. They happen inside shattered aircraft above hostile ground, measured not in miles but in minutes, stolen back from death. Mizpah never landed, but its story did. And as long as it's told, those 10 minutes still matter, a reminder that when everything fails, what endures is human resolve. In the end, the sky took the airplane, but it couldn't take what mattered most. It couldn't take the bond forged in freezing wind. It couldn't take the choices made when there was no manual left to follow. And it couldn't take the meaning of 10 minutes that proved survival is never accidental. The men of Mizpah returned to ordinary lives, but ordinary never meant untouched. They carried the memory quietly, like a weight balanced just right, never dropped, never flaunted. They understood something the rest of the world rarely sees. Courage isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It shows up when systems fail and time runs out. Years passed. Stories faded elsewhere. But among those who were there, the details stayed sharp. The cut of steel through gloves, the way the aircraft answered hands instead of controls, the moment each man stepped into open air, trusting someone else to hold on a little longer. That trust is the legacy, not the wreckage in a forest, not the statistics in a report. The legacy is the decision to stay when leaving would be easier, to lead when there's nothing left to command, to remember the names of the two who didn't come home and live in a way that honors them. Somewhere in history, 10 minutes still hang at 30,000 feet, defying gravity, defying probability. The airplane fell. The story didn't. And as long as it's told, the sky never truly won. In the years that followed, the world found new wars, new machines, new headlines. But nothing ever replaced what happened in those 10 minutes over Budapest. Because some moments are not meant to be surpassed. They are meant to define. Evald Swanson lived a long life. He watched grandchildren grow up in a country that never knew the sound of flak bursting at 30,000 feet. He watched a nation remember World War II through parades and monuments simplified into victories and dates. But he knew the truth was smaller and heavier. The truth lived in seconds where leadership meant staying put, where survival meant trusting the man beside you to pull steel cables with frozen hands while death tore at the airframe. When Swanson died in 2009, he didn't leave behind medals that told the story. He left behind men who remembered, men who knew exactly how close they had come to disappearing, men who carried the names of Dudley and Henderson like a quiet oath. History will say Mizpah was lost. Engineering will say the aircraft was unflyable. Statistics will say survival was unlikely. But those 10 minutes say something else. They say courage is not invincible, it is deliberate. They say heroism doesn't roar, it endures. They say when everything mechanical fails, human resolve can still hold the sky together. The bomber fell into a forest and burned. But the story rose higher than it ever flew. And as long as it's remembered, those 10 minutes never end. And this is where the story finally lands. Not in fire, not in wreckage, not in a forest outside Budapest, but in memory. Because the true ending of Mizpah was never the crash. It was what refused to disappear afterward. Wars end, aircraft burn, names fade from official reports. But some moments push back. They demand to be carried forward, not because they were loud, but because they were honest. 10 minutes of chaos stripped away everything except what mattered most: trust, discipline, and the willingness to stay when leaving would have been safer. No monument stands where Mizpah fell. No marker tells travelers what happened in that patch of trees. Yet the story survives because men survived, and because survival in this case came with memory attached. Memory of frozen hands on steel, of leadership without orders, of silence where instruments once lived. This wasn't